The snow was falling softly that morning, like tiny feathers drifting from a gray sky. The film set looked peaceful, wrapped in white silence. The crew was preparing for the final scene of a movie about courage and love. Cameras stood still for a moment, fog forming on every lens, as if nature wanted to pause the world before the story began. Sandra Bullock stood near a wooden cabin built for the shoot. She looked calm but tired. The past few days had been long and cold, and the storm warnings on the radio made everyone nervous. Yet Sandra smiled at the team, her voice warm and steady as she helped the younger crew members carry their equipment inside. Even in harsh weather, she had a way of bringing calm to others. Keanu Reeves stood a few steps away, his eyes following her quietly. He had always admired her patience. For him, Sandra was not just a co-star, but a friend who carried kindness like light. They had worked together years ago, and even now he remembered how she once said that real strength was not in speaking louder, but in caring deeper. The day began normally. Cameras rolled, laughter echoed, and the mountains glowed faintly under the pale sun. But by afternoon, the sky darkened quickly. Snowflakes grew larger, spinning faster until the world turned white again. The director shouted to pack up, worried about the crew's safety. Everyone rushed to load the vans before the mountain road froze. As people hurried, a voice called out. It was a young assistant named Lily. She had gone down the path to fetch a missing sound recorder and had not returned. The crew started looking around nervously. The wind howled louder, and visibility dropped to a few feet. Sandra looked toward the narrow trail leading into the woods. Without waiting for anyone's command, she pulled her scarf tighter and said she would find Lily. Someone tried to stop her, but Sandra only smiled and said softly, "She's out there scared, and I can't leave her." Before anyone could argue, she stepped into the snowstorm, disappearing behind a curtain of white. Inside the cabin, Keanu realized what had happened. The crew was panicking. The storm had grown stronger, and they could barely keep the fire going. He looked out the frosted window and saw nothing but darkness. His heart pounded as he grabbed his flashlight and coat. Someone warned him not to go. He didn't listen. He just said, "She would have done the same for me," and opened the door. The cold hit him instantly. The wind sliced across his face, and snow filled his boots with every step. He could barely see, but he followed the faint footprints leading away from the cabin. Each step grew heavier, his breath turning into sharp clouds. He called her name again and again, but the storm swallowed his voice. After what felt like an hour, he found something lying near a broken wooden fence. At first, it looked like a pile of snow, but then he saw a hand. It was Sandra, half buried and motionless. Keanu dropped to his knees, brushing the snow from her face. Her skin was pale, her lips blue, and her scarf frozen to the ground. His heart stopped for a second. He took off his heavy coat and wrapped it tightly around her. The wind howled again, throwing snow into his eyes, but he didn't care. He lifted her carefully into his arms, whispering her name as if the sound alone could bring her back. "You'll be okay," he said softly, even though his voice shook. The road back felt endless. He stumbled more than once, nearly falling, but each time he pushed himself up, thinking only of her safety. The freezing wind tore through his clothes, and his hands started to go numb, but he kept walking. When he finally saw the dim lights of the cabin, relief flooded his chest. The crew rushed out when they saw him. Together, they carried Sandra inside and placed her near the fire. People wrapped blankets around her, rubbing her hands gently. Keanu sat beside her, silent, shivering, and refusing any help until he knew she was breathing again. A faint breath escaped her lips, weak but steady. The room filled with quiet tears and smiles. Sandra slowly opened her eyes, her vision blurry, and the first thing she saw was Keanu's face beside her. He was still wearing no coat, his clothes soaked, his hands trembling. She whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." Keanu smiled faintly and said, "Someone once did the same for me." No one understood what he meant, but there was a strange stillness in his voice, like a memory buried deep inside him. The storm outside began to fade, leaving the world silent once more. The snow no longer felt cold. It felt like it had carried a story meant to be told. That night, as Sandra rested near the fire, the crew watched over her. Keanu sat quietly in a corner, staring at the coat now drying by the fire. It was torn in places, the fabric stiff from frost. His hands were bruised and red, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were far away, lost in a past that no one else could see. And somewhere deep inside that silence, fate was quietly preparing to reveal a truth that would change everything. Morning came slowly, hidden behind thick clouds that still carried the scent of the storm. The world outside the cabin was silent, as if the mountains themselves were catching their breath. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, soft and untouched, except for the footprints that told the story of what had happened the night before. Inside, the crew moved quietly. A small fire burned in the center of the cabin, its glow warming the cold wooden walls. Sandra lay near it, covered in blankets, her breathing steady but shallow. Beside her sat Keanu, his fingers wrapped in bandages. He had not slept at all. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire, replaying every moment he had carried her through the storm. When Sandra finally opened her eyes, she saw him there, still as a statue. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Keanu poured her a little warm water and helped her sit up. She looked at him carefully, noticing his bruised hands and frostbitten fingertips. "You should be resting," she said softly. He smiled weakly. "I'm fine. You scared everyone, you know that?" Sandra gave a faint smile and looked toward the window. "I didn't mean to. Lily was out there, and I couldn't just stay inside." Keanu nodded slowly. "You always put others first. That's why everyone trusts you." For a moment, silence filled the air again. Sandra studied his face, sensing something heavy behind his calm words. "You said something last night," she whispered. "Someone once did the same for you." "What did you mean?" Keanu looked away, his eyes darkening slightly. "It's something that happened years ago," he said quietly. "I never talk about it much." She waited patiently, but he didn't continue. Instead, he stood up and looked out the frosted window. The snow outside seemed endless, white and pure. Yet somehow it held a secret that even he couldn't explain. By afternoon, the storm warnings had lifted. A rescue team arrived from the nearby village to help the crew leave the mountain safely. As they loaded their equipment, an old man from the village walked slowly toward the cabin. He wore a thick wool coat and carried a wooden walking stick. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were bright, like someone who had seen many stories unfold in the snow. "You must be the people who were caught in last night's blizzard," he said kindly. "You are lucky to be alive. That storm was one of the worst we've seen in years." Keanu nodded respectfully and thanked him for checking on them. The man looked at Keanu for a long moment before saying, "You carried her through the storm, didn't you?" Keanu hesitated but nodded. "I just did what anyone would have done." The man smiled gently. "Not everyone would. The forest where you found her is known as the Silent Grove. Many years ago, another traveler nearly lost his life in the same place. He was rescued by a woman who gave him her coat and disappeared before anyone could thank her." Everyone went quiet. The man continued. "The villagers still talk about her kindness. We never knew who she was, only that she wore a red scarf and carried warmth in her heart." Sandra listened carefully, her hands trembling slightly. She had heard that story before. Her mother used to tell it when she was a child. Her mother had once volunteered in these mountains to teach children and help travelers. She remembered the same red scarf and the same words her mother had said. "Kindness travels farther than footsteps." She turned to Keanu, her eyes wide. "My mother used to tell that story," she said softly. "She said she once helped a young man who had lost his way in a snowstorm. She gave him her coat and made him promise to live kindly if he survived." Keanu's expression changed. The firelight flickered across his face as if uncovering something long hidden. "Your mother?" he asked in a quiet voice. Sandra nodded. "Her name was Margaret Bullock. She used to work in a volunteer program here many years ago." For a moment, Keanu didn't speak. He looked down, his hands tightening slightly. "I was that man," he said finally. "I was the one she saved." The words fell into the room like a whisper that froze time. The crew stopped moving. Sandra stared at him in disbelief. "You?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. Keanu nodded slowly. "I was 19. I had come here with a group of friends. We got lost in a storm just like last night. I wandered off, trying to find help. I passed out in the snow. When I woke up, I was in a small cabin. There was a woman beside me wearing a red scarf. She gave me her coat and said I should never forget what real warmth feels like. Then she left before morning. I never knew her name. Sandra felt her eyes fill with tears. She reached into her bag, searching for something. She pulled out an old photograph of her mother standing in the same mountains, smiling, wearing that same red scarf. She handed it to him with shaking hands. Keanu looked at the photo for a long time. His breath caught in his chest. "It's her," he whispered. "That's the woman who saved my life." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't because of the cold. It was because of the realization that kindness had traveled through time, circling back in the most unexpected way. Sandra covered her face, overwhelmed. Keanu placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Your mother saved me," he said softly. "And maybe that's why I was meant to find you." The old villager nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the snow remembers what kindness forgets," he said. That night, no one could sleep. Sandra sat by the window, watching the snowflakes fall slowly under the pale moonlight. Each one looked like a small memory drifting through time, landing where it was meant to be. Keanu sat quietly across from her. Their eyes met once, and no words were needed. The truth had found its way through the storm, carried by love, respect, and destiny. But even as peace returned to the mountains, one mystery still remained: how her mother had known he would survive that night, and why fate had brought them back to the same place all these years later. The answer, hidden deep in the silence of the forest, was waiting to be found. The next morning, sunlight finally touched the white slopes for the first time in days. It glittered across the frozen trees, turning the mountains into a painting of gold and silver. The storm had left behind a strange calm, as if the sky itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Inside the cabin, Sandra and Keanu sat quietly beside the fading fire. No one from the crew spoke much that morning. They all felt something sacred had happened the night before, something that went beyond coincidence. Keanu kept staring at the photograph of Sandra's mother, the same red scarf around her neck. He ran his fingers over the worn edges, his thoughts lost somewhere far away. "I never thought I'd see her face again," he said softly. "I tried for years to find out who she was. I went back to that forest many times, asked the villagers, searched for her name in old records, but she seemed to disappear like snow after sunrise." Sandra listened quietly, her heart heavy yet peaceful. "She was like that," she said with a faint smile. "She never wanted to be known. She said helping someone was never about being remembered. It was about making sure someone else could move forward." Keanu looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Then she truly lived by what she said. "She saved my life, and I never even got to say thank you." The old villager returned to the cabin with a small box. His wrinkled hands held it carefully, as though it carried something fragile. "I think this belongs to you," he said, placing it in front of them. The box was carved from wood, covered in faint patterns of leaves and stars. When Sandra opened it, she found a small notebook inside, wrapped in an old red ribbon. On the first page was her mother's handwriting: "For whoever finds this, kindness never ends. It only waits for the right moment to return." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She turned the pages slowly. The notebook was full of notes, sketches, and names of people her mother had helped during her volunteer years. On one of the pages, Keanu's name was written. "Young man, 19, lost in snow near Silent Grove. Gave him my coat. Hope he remembers warmth, not fear." Keanu's hands shook as he touched the ink. "She remembered me," he whispered. "She even wrote about me." Sandra smiled through her tears. "She must have believed you would find your own way to give that warmth to someone else." The villager sat near the door, his eyes on the mountains outside. "Your mother was special," he said. "When she left this place, she told us one thing. She said if kindness ever returned here, it would mean her purpose was complete." His words hung in the air like quiet music. Sandra looked at Keanu and saw the truth in his face. Her mother's act of kindness had not just saved him, it had shaped the man he became. As the day went on, the crew began packing their things, ready to leave the mountains. But Sandra wasn't ready to go yet. She looked toward the forest beyond the cabin, the same path her mother once walked. "I want to see where it happened," she said softly. Keanu nodded immediately. "Then we'll go together." They followed the narrow trail that curved through the trees, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The air was crisp and clear, the silence so deep that even their breaths felt too loud. After half an hour, they reached an open field surrounded by tall pines. In the center stood an old wooden post covered in snow. The villager had told them that this was where the woman with the red scarf had once found a stranger in the snow. The wind whispered through the trees as they stood there, both lost in thought. Keanu knelt beside the post and brushed off the snow. Beneath it was a small metal plate so faded that the words were almost invisible. But when the light hit it just right, they could read the faint engraving. "To those who give warmth to others, may you never grow cold." Sandra touched the plate gently, her fingers trembling. "This must have been left here after she saved you," she said. Keanu nodded. "Maybe someone remembered her, even if she wanted to be forgotten." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind. Then Keanu spoke quietly. "When I was 19, I thought I was strong. I thought life was only about moving forward. But that night taught me that real strength isn't about surviving alone. It's about being touched by someone's kindness and carrying it forward." Sandra looked at him and said, "And you did." "You carried it to me." Keanu smiled gently, his breath visible in the cold air. "Maybe I was meant to. Maybe that's why I felt the need to go after you that night. Something in me knew I couldn't leave you out there. It was like a voice whispering, 'Don't let it end here.'" Snow began to fall again, soft and peaceful. It wasn't harsh like before. It was gentle, almost comforting. The flakes floated around them as if the mountains were blessing the moment. Sandra took a deep breath and said, "My mother used to say the snow listens to the heart. Maybe it heard yours?" Keanu looked up at the falling snow. Then maybe it heard hers, too. They left a small flower near the post before walking back to the cabin. As they turned away, Sandra glanced back one last time. In the quiet distance, she thought she saw something. A faint shimmer of red moving through the trees, like a scarf fluttering in the wind. For a moment, her heart skipped. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, "Thank you, Mom." Back at the cabin, the crew was waiting. The old villager handed Sandra a folded piece of paper. "This was inside the box, too," he said. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter written in her mother's handwriting. "If one day the person I saved finds you, tell him he was the reason I believed kindness never goes in vain." Sandra read it twice, her eyes wide with emotion. She handed it to Keanu, who read it in silence. The firelight reflected in his eyes as he whispered, "She knew." Sandra nodded, her voice soft. She always did. That night, as the last fire in the cabin flickered low, both of them sat quietly side by side. Outside, the snow fell gently once again, like time repeating its own promise. Somewhere in the mountains, it felt as though the spirit of a kind woman smiled, watching two souls she had unknowingly connected through her endless compassion. But fate was not finished yet. There was still one more secret the forest held, something neither of them had seen, something her mother had left behind in that place long before she ever became a story. And soon, the snow would reveal it. The next morning began with an unusual brightness. Sunlight poured through the mist like golden threads falling over the white hills. The storm had passed, but something about the air felt different, calm yet filled with quiet energy, as if the mountains were holding their breath for what was about to come. Sandra woke early. She stepped outside the cabin and stood in the snow barefoot for a moment, feeling its softness under her feet. It was cold but not harsh. The sky stretched wide and blue above her, and she felt her mother's presence in the stillness. Keanu joined her a few minutes later, his steps slow but steady. His hands were still bandaged, yet his expression carried peace. "You didn't sleep much again?" he said softly. "No," Sandra replied with a faint smile. "I couldn't stop thinking about that letter. About how she knew you would find me one day." Keanu nodded. Maybe some things are written long before we understand them. They both looked toward the forest path that led to the old wooden post. Something pulled them there again, like an invisible hand calling them back. The villager who had helped them noticed their silence and said, "The forest remembers. If you listen carefully, it always speaks to those who carry gratitude." After breakfast, Sandra and Keanu decided to visit the grove one last time before leaving the mountains. They wanted to leave flowers for her mother and thank the land that had carried her memory. The villager guided them through a different trail this time, one less traveled, winding deeper into the forest. The snow here was untouched, the air filled with pine and quiet songs of distant birds. It was beautiful, yet mysterious, as though each step brought them closer to something hidden. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached a small clearing surrounded by frozen trees. In the center stood an old half-buried cabin, its roof covered in snow. The villager stopped walking. "This," he said softly, "is the place where she once lived. This is where the woman with the red scarf stayed during her volunteer work." Sandra froze. Her heart pounded as she looked at the small cabin. "This is where she lived," she whispered. The villager nodded. "After she saved that young man, she spent a few more months here. Then one morning she left quietly, saying her work was done." Keanu stared at the door, unable to move. The image of that night long ago came back to him clearly. The faint light of a fire, the warmth of a coat, the woman's calm voice saying, "Remember warmth, not fear." The door creaked as Sandra gently pushed it open. Inside, dust and sunlight danced together. Old notebooks were stacked on a table half covered in frost. A rusty lantern hung from a wooden beam, and on one wall, carved faintly into the wood, were words written by hand. "For every act of kindness, there is another waiting to return." Sandra's eyes filled with tears again. She traced the carved letters gently, her hand trembling. "She wrote this," she whispered. Keanu stepped closer, reading it quietly. "She believed kindness was a circle," he said. She proved it. In one corner of the cabin, a small chest rested beneath a blanket of snow dust. Sandra knelt down and opened it slowly. Inside were folded letters, old photographs, and one small locket. She picked it up carefully. It was golden, shaped like a snowflake, with a single word engraved inside. Hope. "She used to wear this," Sandra said softly. "I remember holding it when I was little. She told me it was her lucky charm." Under the locket, Keanu found another folded page, older than the rest. He opened it gently, and inside was a short note in the same handwriting. "If you ever return here, follow the sun where it first touches the snow. There lies what you are meant to find." Sandra looked at him, puzzled. "Follow the sun?" The villager smiled faintly. "There's a small rise behind this cabin. When the sun sets, its light hits a particular spot on the ground. She used to go there every evening." They stepped outside again, the snow sparkling under the morning light. They waited as the sun rose higher, its rays gliding slowly across the forest floor. After a few moments, the golden light struck a spot near a tall pine tree. Keanu walked toward it and knelt down. Brushing away the snow, he found a flat stone beneath. Carved into it were faint words. "Here lies the promise of warmth, passed from one soul to another." Under the stone, they discovered a small metal container, sealed tightly. When Sandra opened it, there was a folded piece of cloth inside, the same red scarf. She held it against her chest, tears falling silently. The fabric was old but still soft, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. "It's hers," she whispered. "She left it here." Keanu smiled gently. Maybe she wanted it to be found by the right person. At the right time, as Sandra held the scarf, a memory came back to her, her mother wrapping it around her shoulders when she was a child, saying, "One day, this scarf will remind you that warmth can travel through time." Keanu looked at the scarf and said quietly, "She was right. It traveled through me to you." The villager's eyes glistened as he spoke softly. "Your mother once told me that love does not disappear. It changes shape. It moves from one person to another, sometimes through hands, sometimes through hearts." The sun climbed higher, painting the trees in gold. Sandra looked at Keanu, her voice trembling with emotion. "This scarf connected us long before we met. It carried her kindness forward. Maybe that's why you found me that night. Keanu nodded, his eyes soft. I didn't find you, he said. She did. They stood together in silence, the scarf between them, glowing softly in the sunlight. It was no longer just a piece of cloth. It was a bridge between two souls, a reminder that kindness never ends. Before leaving, they placed the locket beside the stone, letting it rest there as a sign of gratitude. As they turned back toward the path, the wind rose gently, lifting the edge of the red scarf and making it dance in the air, as if the mountains themselves were saying goodbye. But as they walked away, Keanu glanced one last time toward the cabin. In the corner of his eye, he saw a faint reflection in the window, an outline of a woman smiling softly, her scarf glowing red in the morning sun. He didn't say anything. He just smiled back and whispered, "Thank you." What neither of them knew was that the scarf still held one final message, hidden within its folds. One last truth her mother had left for the moment when kindness had fully completed its circle. And soon, that secret would reveal itself. The red scarf rested gently in Sandra's hands as they walked back toward the cabin. The forest around them was calm, almost listening. Every sound, the crunch of snow, the whisper of wind, felt like part of something larger, something sacred. Back inside, the crew was preparing to leave. The villager helped them pack, but his eyes kept drifting toward the scarf. She left that for a reason, he said softly. Perhaps it still carries her words? Sandra nodded. Her fingers brushed along the fabric and she felt something uneven near the edge. She looked closer and noticed faint stitching, older than the rest. Carefully, she tugged at the corner, revealing a thin folded strip of cloth sewn into the lining. Inside it was a small note yellowed by time. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The writing was faint but still clear. If this scarf ever finds my daughter, tell her she already knows what to do. Pass the warmth forward. Sandra pressed the note against her heart. Her voice was barely a whisper. She knew I'd be here. She knew this would happen. Keanu smiled gently. And she trusted you to continue what she started. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Sandra tied the scarf around her neck. She stood beside Keanu, watching the golden light fade across the snow. This isn't an ending, she said quietly. It's a beginning, Keanu nodded. Kindness never ends, it just changes hands. They left the cabin together, walking down the mountain path as the scarf fluttered softly in the cold wind. Somewhere behind them, the forest glowed faintly, as if the spirit of her mother was watching, proud that the circle of warmth had finally found its way home. Days passed, but the memory of the mountains stayed with them. Back in the city, the noise of traffic and lights could not erase the silence they had carried home. The red scarf now hung framed on Sandra's wall, its color still bright as if it refused to fade. Each time she looked at it, she felt her mother's voice in her heart, whispering softly, "Pass the warmth forward." Keanu visited often. Their bond had changed. They no longer saw each other as actors or colleagues, but as two lives forever linked by one act of kindness that began years before either of them understood its meaning. One evening, they sat in Sandra's quiet living room, sipping tea as the rain touched the windows. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "Every day," he said softly. "Not because it was frightening, but because it reminded me how connected we all are. Your mother saved me once, and somehow, that moment led me to save you. It feels like a circle that never ends." Sandra smiled. "Then maybe it's our turn to keep it moving." She opened her laptop and showed him a document titled The Circle of Warmth Foundation. It was a project she had begun after returning from the mountains, a charity to support travelers, volunteers, and strangers who help others in times of crisis. She wanted to honor her mother's spirit through action. Keanu read quietly, his expression warm. "This is beautiful," he said. "Your mother would be proud." "It's not just mine," Sandra replied. "It's ours. You're part of this story, too." Together, they launched the foundation. Their first initiative built shelters in mountain villages for stranded travelers, each marked with a small sign that read, For every act of kindness, there is another waiting to return. The world soon learned the story behind those words. People began sharing their own stories of kindness online, tagging the foundation with messages of gratitude and hope. A quiet movement started. No fame, no spotlight, just simple acts done by ordinary hearts. Months later, Sandra returned to the same mountains for a memorial event. Keanu joined her once again. The old villager greeted them with a smile, his eyes glowing with peace. "The forest remembers you," he said, "and it remembers her, too." They walked together to the old wooden post in the silent grove. The snow sparkled softly beneath the morning sun. Sandra laid a single flower beside the stone and whispered, "We did it, Mom. Your warmth still travels." Keanu knelt beside her, his breath visible in the cold air. "And it always will." As they stood in silence, a gentle gust of wind lifted a strand of the red scarf Sandra wore. It floated briefly before settling back on her shoulder. For a fleeting moment, they both thought they saw a faint figure among the trees, a woman smiling softly, her scarf glowing red under the sun. Sandra's eyes filled with quiet tears, but her heart felt calm. She turned to Keanu and said, "It's like she's telling us that kindness never dies. It just finds new hands." Keanu nodded, his voice low, "And it found the right ones." They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the sunlight melt into the snow. The air was cold, but inside them there was warmth. An endless warmth passed from one soul to another, carried through time, carried through love. As they left the mountains, the wind moved gently through the trees, echoing the same words her mother once wrote. For every act of kindness, there is another waiting to return. And so, the circle of warmth continued, silent, humble, eternal.